So good afternoon. Over the last talk, I'm happy to introduce Sebastian Porsdam Mann. So he did a PhD in neuroethics at the University of Cambridge. Then he did a PhD at Harvard, and also after that he did a postdoc. I'm sorry. After his postdoc in Harvard, he did a postdoc at Copenhagen and also at Oxford, and now he's also doing a PhD of law in Oxford. So he has done a lot of work in ethics and also in the life sciences. So he applied ethics to life sciences. He did various different topics, for example, data sharing, also synthetic biology, etc. He also, a few years ago, there's colleagues of him, Philip Geyer and Peter Tribe, wrote a very big paper on clinical proteomics, where they actually did plasma proteomics of 1,000 samples, and he did the ethics. So he did an ethics paper on that data set. So it was very interesting to be able to hear his talk now. Thank you.
So thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the invite to be here. It's a pleasure and an honor to share some of the work that I and my colleagues have done over the years. So as introduced, my background is in bioethics, and I've worked on a couple of different topics of relevance to the symposium today, including informed consent and its relevance to data access, which I'll touch upon later in my talk. So in around 2019, I teamed up with my father, Matthias Mann, and Philip Geyer and Peter Treit from his lab to work on ethical aspects of clinical proteomics. This effort led to 2 papers, the contents of which I will share with you in the first part of my talk today. And for those who are interested in further details, I can highly recommend the article shown on this slide, which Juan has also mentioned in his talk, based in part on our articles and many interviews, and which is just really exceptionally well written. I'll then spend some time talking about another relevant source of norms, namely human rights. So human rights are interesting, at least to me, because they're protected by law. I started getting interested in human rights law when I realized that many of the same issues and debates that we're used to framing as ethical matters can also be reframed as a matter of rights and therefore be brought under a legal umbrella. This is relevant not only because human rights have more political weight than do ethical arguments, but also because as a part of law, they can be used to challenge other laws, such as the GDPR that we've heard about already. In our context, 2 of the most relevant human rights are the human right to the highest attainable standard of health and the human right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, or the rights to health and to science in shorthand. I've been working on the latter right, the right to science, since 2016, and as mentioned, I've recently become so convinced of its utility, importance, and interest that I've returned to school and I'm doing a second doctorate on that topic. So my primary aim over the following half hour or so is to introduce you to this right and to demonstrate how it can be relevant also to clinical proteomics and to the goals of the symposium, as well as to scientific goals more broadly. Another aim is to convince you that ethics and law are not only challenges to be overcome, but powerful and necessary tools that can either help or hinder scientific progress depending on how they're developed and implemented. It's worth keeping in mind that ethics is simply the question of how things ought to be, and law is simply the attempt at making things so. There are good and bad ways to do this, but we should be very clear that they are necessary and can have the potential to be very beneficial. Of course, there are legitimate ethical and regulatory concerns relating to privacy, justice, and individual autonomy, which need to be addressed by ethical codes and by legal frameworks. In my opinion, however, well-known problems relating to data access, selection bias, delays introduced by ethical review, and inefficiencies due to GDPR compliance or HIPAA compliance in the United States are all instances of well-intentioned normative efforts that have struck the wrong balance between the interests of scientific progress and individual rights. Or, put another way, that may have struck an appropriate balance, but have since been interpreted in practice more restrictively than was perhaps intended. To push back against overly restrictive effects requires fighting fire with fire. Ethical arguments need to be addressed by other and better ethical arguments. Legal restrictions need to be counterweighed by other legal duties or other legal interpretations. This is one of the roles that I argue bioethics and human rights can play. So I'll begin by introducing our past efforts on bioethics and clinical proteomics, the aforementioned 2 papers. I'll then introduce the ethical duty of easy rescue and the right to science under human rights law. Finally, I will attempt to show the potential of these normative tools for facilitating scientific progress. So around 2019, Philip Gaia, who's pictured here to the right, Peter Treit, second from the right, myself and my father, began talking about the potential for individual re-identification based on proteomic samples. So this is right after GDPR. And the potential relevance of bioethics to the resulting privacy issues. Philip decided to see, and these are his slides that I'm borrowing for the moment. Philip decided to see whether he could indeed match samples in a pre-existing data set taken from a weight loss study. The idea was to see what he could find out as a practical matter in one paper, and for all of us to reflect more abstractly on the ethical implications of these findings in the second paper. Philip defined a protein as individual specific for the purposes of this paper if its level in a participant was more than 1.5-fold different from the population median, or at least a quarter of all study participants, and had a coefficient of variation below 20% over time. 71% of all proteins fulfilled these criteria. Pearson correlation coefficients of these individual specific proteins had much higher intra-individual correlation as compared to inter-individual correlations. Across the entire study, the median intra-individual correlation was 0.974, and the inter-individual correlation was 0.928. I tried to identify individuals solely by Pearson correlation coefficients of their individual specific protein. Defining the pre-weight loss time point as a reference, all but one of the 252 comparisons were assigned to the correct individual. And in the one case that wasn't, the correct individual was ranked second most likely. As a proof of principle, he was also able to correctly match 89% of samples based on present and absent variant peptides using allele information contained in the proteome. Next, we wondered if we could obtain what's known as incidental findings. So these are health-relevant information that hasn't been explicitly searched for, but nevertheless shows up during analysis. Again, as proof of principle, we found ApoE allele status, which indicates cardiovascular and Alzheimer's risk. A panel of proteins indicating systemic inflammation levels, and protein glycation levels, indicating the presence of infection or diabetes status or pre-diabetic status, respectively. Finally, we tried deriving potentially sensitive personal information about individuals based on their samples. For example, we looked at levels of estrogen-regulated proteins, such as sex hormone binding globulin, and the pregnancy some protein, which allowed us to determine gender. Placental proteins, such as the family of pregnancy-specific glycoproteins, could be used to reflect pregnancy status. Interestingly, we found that sex hormone binding globulin and proteins of the innate immune system are among the proteins most affected by body mass and could therefore be used to estimate body fat. Finally, vitamin D binding protein varies a lot by ethnicity, and so it can be used to determine or predict ethnic status. Although we didn't check in this reanalysis, it seems plausible that many other types of potentially sensitive and private information can be derived, for example, drug and alcohol medication metabolites. So during the process of writing up the paper just discussed, we came across a handful of other papers that had touched on these or similar topics, including several by Kurt and Juan, who are here today. Preparation for our second paper, we decided to carry out a systematic review of ethical issues in clinical proteomics in order to try to gather everything that's already been written and put our own analysis on a firmer footing. We went through a pretty rigorous review process, which I won't bore. And we ended up identifying 40 ethical issues across the 16 included studies, which we then grouped into 10 themes that you can see here. These included the 3 issues raised by our first paper, that is re-identifiability, incidental findings, and potentially sensitive information. But they also included further topics ranging from quality, control, and standards to the lack of international guidance on bioethical questions in clinical proteomics. Next, we surveyed the bioethical literature on clinical genomics for their answers to these questions, since many of the same topics have been discussed at length there. This literature suggested that actionable information should be returned to the individual or their healthcare provider, while unactionable information should generally not. It is important for individuals to be informed of the likelihood of such findings at the point of consent, says this literature, and for their preferences to be respected. Ideally, researchers should establish an institutional review board approved plan for the return of individual results and validate results prior to return, as we just heard in the talk before the last. However, there are challenges in determining the actionability and health relevance of findings, particularly with the high prevalence of variants of uncertain significance. Additionally, there are questions about incorporating incidental findings into health registries and scientific databases, about findings that come from reanalyzing old data, about what to do in cases where individuals are unavailable for recontact, in cases where the information is relevant for the health of third parties, usually a family member. The experience of clinical genomics also raised issues of justice that might be potentially relevant in the context of clinical proteomics. Examples include the accuracy of reference proteomes for different ethnicities, and access to the benefits of clinical proteomics for disadvantaged communities. There are also concerns about the overlapping regulatory structures for proteomic data and how to manage the knowledge generated by research in a way that maximizes public benefits. The future development of clinical proteomics relies on maintaining the public support and trust. It is important for commercial applications to provide transparency and sufficient information about the secondary processing, selling, or sharing of customer data. Next, we turn to offering some of our own thoughts and perspectives on ethics. To address issues such as bias and lack of statistical power, we argued that researchers should shift to larger sample sizes and parallel analysis, standardize pre-analytical sample handling, use methods to detect and control bias. Additionally, principles of open and transparent science, including data sharing and accessibility, are crucial for realizing the full potential of clinical proteomics while respecting the rights and autonomy of individuals. The proteomics community has made progress in data sharing and interpretation through guidelines and consortiums, as we've also heard today. And bioinformatics analysis should be accessible through open source code to maximize the utility and knowledge from the human proteome. Finally, we argued that the bioethical framework of balancing principles of beneficence and justice while respecting individual rights can be useful in identifying future opportunities instead of just focusing on risks and problems. For example, one way to obviate ethical concerns might be simply not analyzing or returning information that could be potentially medically relevant. But in doing so, opportunities to benefit people are lost. Additionally, in the future, proteomic profiling could be applied to preventative care and to general wellness or even to enhancement purposes, rather than just diagnosing and treating disease, which could lead to improved human health and welfare in the same way that treating disease could. A shift in perspective from solely diagnosing disease to preventing it could open new opportunities for improving overall health. So one of the main take-home messages from our work is the need to proactively address ethical and regulatory issues to prevent having solutions imposed from outside down the line. Perhaps the ultimate example of why this is a good idea can be found in the story of how we got to the current situation of the institutional and IRB review requirements, and to a lesser extent regulations such as the GDPR and HIPAA. The IRB and ethics review system, as we know it today, came about as a 1974 US law reacting to experiments such as the Willowbrook study of hepatitis transmission in a hospital for mentally impaired children, the Tuskegee syphilis study on Black Americans on the natural course of syphilis, despite the availability of safe and effective treatment, Bernald's state school trials using radioactive minerals in impaired children, and the Jewish chronic disease hospital study, in which chronically ill patients were injected with cancer cells to monitor rejection. Prior to the introduction of this law, medical ethics was supposed to be based on the Nuremberg Declaration and various professional codes, and these in turn were innovations that stemmed from even worse abuses during the Second World War. My point is not to compare clinical proteomics to these types of experiments, but rather to point out that there was a natural progression from no regulation to soft internal regulation to soft external regulation in the form of the Nuremberg Declaration, to finally hard external regulation like the National Research Act of 1974. The repeated lack of self-regulation efforts eventually led to a harsh reaction that introduced well-intentioned but ill-informed requirements on everyone. A similar story can be told concerning the use of personal data and the development of the GDPR, albeit that there are different culprits in that story. I'll talk a little bit more about RB ethics review because I think it's a great example, not only of the importance of self-regulation, but also of the positive potential of using bioethical for ethical analysis. I'm sure many people here are aware there's an entire smorgasbord of problems associated with the current ethical review process. Ethics review is required across the board, even for studies where it isn't or shouldn't be necessary. It takes far too long, wasting time and money and leading to unnecessary antagonism towards what's actually well-intentioned compliance and ethics efforts. When handled by compliance or legal officers, it can degenerate into an exercise of liability avoidance. There are multiple different and overlapping regulatory frameworks which prevent standardization, and that's especially problematic for multi-center trials and for efforts to streamline ethics review. Perhaps less well known is the fact that ethics review is rarely carried out by individuals with training in ethics or in law, and almost never by people with more specific expertise in clinical research or applied ethics. The work is not compensated in either time, money, or prestige, and there are few to no mechanisms for ensuring accountability or transparency. Perhaps most damningly, inter-rater reliability for ethics review on the same proposed studies are extremely low, which means two different people look at the study and come up with two different conclusions. Since there are no or few objective criteria, and as mentioned, little to no training, ethics review is often a subjective exercise of personal or group opinion. Because of their focus on consent and liability issues, many IRBs do not pay attention to fundamental ethical requirements, such as basic scientific merit and appropriate experimental design, and do not make use of existing flexibilities in consent and other requirements. Although this is not my area of expertise, as I understand the situation, compliance processes aimed at respecting data privacy legislation, such as the GDPR, are subject to many of the same problems. In this context, the problems are intensified by a lack of cases or official guidance on the meaning of the terms used in the GDPR. Compliance is difficult and expensive at the best of times, but obviously even more so when there is little clarity as to the extent of exemptions for research and other legitimate public benefit data use. The irony is, of course, that these well-intentioned efforts may end up doing more harm than good, because they inhibit scientific progress or delay it, as well as participation in science. This is true across the board, but it's even more so the case for under-resourced and otherwise disadvantaged researchers and research institutions who have fewer capacities, experience, and resources to address complex regulatory requirements. This too is obviously not what was intended. Importantly, in my opinion, to counteract these inhibitory effects, we need to engage at the same level of analysis. And this is where the positive potential of bioethics and human rights law for facilitating biomedical research comes in. Ethical counterarguments are required to respond to ethical arguments, and legal rebuttals are required for legal analyses. These come in many forms, but I want to pay particular attention to two of them, both because I've worked on them before and because I think they're useful tools for scientists to use when interacting with ethical and legal compliance procedures. They are the duty of easy rescue, which is an ethical concept, and the human right to enjoy the benefits of the progress of science and its applications, which is a bundle of rights and obligations relating to science under international law. The requirement of informed consent in human subjects research originates from historical instances of medical atrocities, as already mentioned. The requirement of informed consent is supposed to protect against such abuses by ensuring that subjects have to give their consent with adequate understanding and in the absence of coercion. It makes a lot of sense in the context of invasive studies such as experimental surgery, but it doesn't make as much sense on research on pre-existing data sources. The risks involved in secondary research are very different and generally smaller, relating essentially to the misuse of sensitive information and associated privacy breaches. Actual such breaches come almost exclusively from businesses that handle electronic health records. Very few come from primary care, and almost none come from research use. Even if patients decline to consent, their medical records still exist and are subject to essentially the same risk of theft and misuse as they would be if they had consented. Finally, the requirement of informed consent can lead to selection bias, reducing the quality and amount of data available for research and limiting severely the generalizability of results. For these reasons, my colleagues and I have previously argued in this paper that there is a moral duty of easy rescue to contribute data for use in public benefit health research. To illustrate the duty of easy rescue, Peter Singer famously described the following thought experiment. If I am walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant. Well, the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. This deceptively simple thought experiment illustrates a situation in which a person can benefit another greatly at minimal cost to themselves. Such situations are intuitively different from situations in which benefiting others is associated with greater cost or risk. A person who attempts to rescue a drowning child in deep waters with strong currents, for example, is endangering their own life for the benefit of another. Although we admire and praise such people, we would not necessarily find fault with others who fail to act in a similar selfless way. The situation is different where the rescue is easy. Leaving a child to drown in a shallow pool is morally abhorrent. By extension, not contributing your data is also unethical. The duty of easy rescue can be formalized in this way. When the cost to X of performing some action is small, and the benefit to Y is large, then X ought to perform that action. The principle can also take a collective form, called the collective duty of easy rescue. When the benefit to Y is large of G'ing and the cost to each of X1 to Xn is small of each G'ing, and each of X1 to Xn ought to G. In the context of public benefit health research, the benefit to society is very large of individuals contributing data. And the cost to each individual of doing so is negligible. So therefore, we should all contribute data. Another way to phrase this argument is that health research on pre-existing pseudonymized data sets generally involves minimal or no risk to data subjects. Regulations are supposed to reflect this fact. They actually contain minimal risk exemptions generally. In law more broadly, the equivalent concept is known as a de minimis exception and refers to situations in which insignificant amounts of money, harm, or risk can be ignored for legal purposes. The duty of easy rescue and minimal risk exemptions have the potential to be used as counterarguments for overbearing ethics requirements. In practice, they could be used to argue for rules which already allow for expedited ethics review of minimally risky research pre-existing data, but which due to a general culture of caution are very rarely used in practice. My final topic for the day is the human right to science, as mentioned earlier. This is a legal concept that is heavily underdeveloped, but which nevertheless has the potential to be used as a counterweight to data protection legislation and as an argument for positive or negative scientific freedom. Just out of personal interest, has anybody here heard of this before? One, okay. The second person I ever met. So as is the case with bioethics and consent requirements, the ideas underlying international human rights law are ancient in origin, but were developed into their modern form following the Second World War. International human rights law derives from documents and treaties signed by governments. These documents contain obligations which governments voluntarily submit themselves to when they sign and subsequently ratify the relevant treaties. The most important human rights for science are contained in this International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 12 of it recognizes the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, while Article 15 recognizes several rights related to science. Article 15(1)b recognizes the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, which of course requires there to be scientific progress in the first place. We know from the drafting history of this provision, from scholarship and from official UN commentary, this right was meant to cover not only a right to passively benefit from science, but also to actively participate in it. This second participatory right is hindered by unnecessary delays and interferences with scientific projects, such as overzealous interpretations of data protection regulations. Article 15(2) places an obligation on states to develop, conserve, and diffuse science. This is a positive obligation. It means the states have to do something to facilitate science. Article 15(3) then imposes a duty on states to respect the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity, which is a negative duty to preventing interference. In both cases, unnecessary restrictions on obtaining, processing, and sharing data would seem to be incompatible with these legal obligations. Finally, Article 15(4) exhorts states to encourage and develop international scientific contact and cooperation. The way this is phrased makes clear that it does not impose a binding obligation. States are supposed to recognize the benefits. They're not obligated to do anything about it. Yet it's still important as an expression of principle. International scientific cooperation is in turn hampered by the lack of harmonization between different regulatory regimes. This right to science is part of international human rights law, which is itself part of public international law. The way this body of law is supposed to work is that governments voluntarily sign treaties, as already mentioned, thus committing themselves to following the terms in the treaties when these are ratified in Congress or Parliament. Once ratified, the terms of the treaty can automatically get incorporated into domestic law in so-called monist legal systems. In other so-called dualist systems, ratification does not automatically transfer international law into the domestic legal books, but rather triggers a duty on legislatures to bring their domestic legislation in line with international obligations. Either way, the terms are supposed to be adhered to. Now, the main feature which distinguishes international from domestic law is that there is no international police force, the power and legitimacy needed to enforce these commitments. This explains why none of us have heard of this. As a result, there is a big difference in practical enforcement of international human rights norms as compared to, say, domestic civil rights legislation. However, these rights still have enormous political and moral cachet, even where the letter of the law is not observed. Holding governments to their own freely made promises is a powerful rhetorical device, which has been used to great effect in other settings, such as access to essential medicines. I see no reason why the right to science couldn't serve the same function for scientists. Take an example, Belgium is a monist system. This means that international law is automatically converted into domestic law. Belgium has signed and ratified the relevant treaty, and has thus accepted the various right to science obligations. This means that anyone subject to Belgian jurisdiction could in theory sue the Belgian government in domestic courts if the government violates any of these right to science obligations, for example, by interpreting data protection and institutional review regulations too restrictively. As far as I'm aware, there aren't yet any actual cases where this has been done. There also is no in principle reason why it couldn't be done. I mentioned earlier that there is no international police force enforcing these international obligations. Instead, there are so-called treaty monitoring bodies, which are independent groups of experts appointed by UN member states. The countries whose governments have signed and ratified an optional protocol, which is an additional treaty that relates to this one, individuals have the right to submit complaints directly to this treaty monitoring body. In our context, the relevant treaty body is the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Belgium acceded to the optional protocol in 2014. This means that any scientist working here could submit a complaint directly to this monitoring body, force it to take a stance about the issues contained in the complaint. But the reason I mention it in this context is not to sue the state or to make complaints to international bodies, but because it can also be used to support interpretations of other laws, such as privacy protection law. So I mentioned earlier that, as far as I'm aware, there's not yet very good guidance on the research exemptions for GDPR. Though the GDPR imposes strict consent requirements, as we heard earlier, it means that consent must be specific and explicit. It also contains very broadly worded research exemptions, including substantial public interest, preventive medicine and medical diagnosis, public health, or archiving for scientific purposes. Where data are processed without consent, says the GDPR, appropriate safeguards, including data minimization and pseudo-randomization, should be used. Processing should be proportionate to the aim pursued, carried out in accordance with the national law, and respect, quote, the essence of the right to data privacy. As I understand it, how each of these terms, appropriate safeguards, substantial public interest, and so on, is to be understood is not yet clearly defined. Here, a hypothetical data protection officer could argue that other concurrent obligations, such as the right to scientific progress and the right to health, motivate interpreting these exemptions in a way that facilitates science rather than hinders it, or a scientist interacting with this hypothetical data protection officer. So my purposes in this talk have been twofold. One is to introduce our work on proteomics, which I'm very glad to see that somebody else used that word earlier. The duty of easy rescue and the right to science. And second, to argue that ethics and law doesn't always have to be an exercise in negativity or in avoidance. It can also be used to help further scientific progress and interest. After all, pursuing knowledge and technology aimed at helping people become healthier is one of the most morally significant tasks that anyone can carry out today. As I wrap up, I'd like to make a few final points. For one, questions surrounding ethics, standards, and regulations will be asked and will be answered, whether or not scientists join the conversation. Second, how laws such as the GDPR or any of the newer data protection regulations, ethics review regulations, international human rights, and so on, relevant to science are interpreted can be influenced by the public, including scientists. Speaking from experience, I know that many colleagues would be delighted to collaborate with people that are actually doing the work on the ground, such as you guys. Finally, however, if scientists don't try to join in these discussions, their voices simply won't be heard. There are no alternative mechanisms to be heard. Interpretations and discussions will happen anyway. So it is better to engage in these discussions, even if they might seem abstract and theoretical and far removed from practice, because they have very real and concrete effects on the scientific endeavor, whether for good or for ill, up for all of us to decide. With that, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Philip Gaia, Peter Treit, Gil Omen, Matthias Mann,